Roger Michael Reitman, born and raised in Chicago, Illinois. Born on January 11th, 1944. My parents, my father came from Germany, he was a German immigrant in 1928 to escape Hitler Youth, and my mother was an orphan. Her mother died 3 days into her life. My education, I have 16 years of Catholic education. I went to St. Mary's College here in Winona, Minnesota. Graduated in '66 with a degree in business administration. Well, it's kind of a three-part answer to that question. My father being a German immigrant, escaping Hitler Youth, realizing what freedom is about. Well, I mean, they were free to some degree, but his mother knew what was coming for Germany. Second thing is my brother John was a Marine. He was 7 years older, so he was very influential. The third reason, I was born in 1944, so I got caught up in the after World War II euphoria. And so I played, soldier, cowboy, and Indian, the whole 9 yards, and watched shows like Victory at Sea that were all about our winning this war and defeating not one evil, but two. And so for those three reasons, the military was a natural evolution for me. Well, as an officer, officers are never drafted. And so I chose to serve my country. I attended 3 schools when I joined the Marine Corps in training. And the first one was Officer Candidate School. It was a 10-week school. My mentor at St. Mary's College back then was a fellow by the name of Dr. Robert Wagner. And he was a lieutenant colonel in the Army Reserve. I was leaning towards the Marine Corps because of my brother, and he reinforced that because of the 10-week program. The Army has a 6-month program. The Marines have a 10-week program, and so it's the short and sweet is kind of a little bit of sarcasm involved. There was nothing short or sweet about it. It was the longest 10 weeks of my life. But in Officer Candidate School, we learned the basics of what it would be like to be a Marine, or in the Army called a soldier. So it was all of the things that the enlisted men do. Digging foxholes, firing at the range, orientation to lots of different things. Leadership was touched on to make sure that we were ready to be officers, because the purpose of Officer Candidate School is to determine whether or not you have the potential to be an officer. So there's a lot of physical fitness, mental acumen, leadership. Those are the 3 things. And after Officer Candidate School was the basic school. That was a 5-month to 6-month in peacetime, a little shorter in wartime. And it's what I call the officer finishing school. You're actually trained how to be a Marine officer, and you're treated like an officer. So there isn't the stress that we had and the harassment that we had as officer candidates. So at the basic school, we learned all about the various disciplines within the military: infantry, artillery, communications, logistics, command and control. Today it'd be computers. And we learned what each one of those disciplines were. And the reason for that, not only to know what was going on, but we had to select at the end of the school, towards the end of the school, what discipline we wanted to serve our country as. Within the basic school was also, we've got to throw hand grenades, fire the M60 machine gun. We went to an artillery battery and found out what indirect fire is all about. We had an air orientation. None of us were going to be air officers, but we call them the Airedales. The Airedales went to a separate school. We were immersed in each one of the disciplines, not to the degree to which you would be with your eventual military occupational specialty. Like as an artillery officer, I didn't learn all about artillery, but I knew enough to make an intelligent decision about whether or not that was a good move for me. And finally, the third school was Fort Sill, Oklahoma Artillery School, and it's an Army school. Marines attend this school. It's one school for both branches, and only the Army and the Marine Corps have artillery. The Marines were expected to finish in the top 10% of their class. We thought, oh boy, this is quite the burden. We actually accomplished that. We were probably 10% of the class, but we finished high. And it wasn't like we were really any better than our Army counterparts. We just worked harder, studied harder, and played less. Artillery school was all about learning fire direction. When we talk about artillery, it's both art and science. We have a fire direction component, which when you have to get rounds on the target, it's a specific kind of endeavor. The battery has to be surveyed properly and very technically oriented. It's also an art. The forward observer is the one that adjusts the rounds onto the target. The 105 howitzer has an 11,500 meter maximum range. So we were typically out there 10,000 meters, 7, 8 miles away. And obviously the guns cannot see 7, 8 miles, so you need a forward observer to see the targets and to take the targets under attack with the coordination of the infantry, because the forward observer team, which I was a part of, that's what I did most of my tour in Vietnam, travels with the infantry, so we're an attachment to the infantry. A forward air controller is attached to the infantry from the air side of the house. If fighter jets come in, they have to be controlled by a ground controller, and that's a forward air controller. So that was the summer of '67, 3-month school. We spent a lot of time sitting on what we call the hill, looking at Blockhouse Signal Mountain, there was a mountain, and there was a blockhouse on it. And we had to, there would be targets around the blockhouse, so it would be an old rusty tank. And he'd say, okay, men, and there'd be 100 of us in these bleachers. And he'd say, men, your target is a rusty tank. And then he'd go, it's three fingers to the right and 2 fingers down from Blockhouse Signal Mountain. So you'd have to, then you get your binoculars out there, and then it was all calibrated within the binoculars in mills. And you'd calculate how far, and then you'd look at your map and you'd determine, where you thought the target would be. The stress of this was that you never knew if you were going to be chosen out of the 100 people to actually take the target under attack. You had to pass that part of the course to become an artillery officer. I had already become a Marine officer, but I wanted to be artillery, and so you needed to pass that course. It was about 10 months of pretty intense training, and by the time I got done, 10 months after I started, I felt like I was ready to go to war. The Marine Corps did a really outstanding job of preparing us for what we had to do. This might sound strange, but none of us really engaged in that kind of conversation. We joined the military to serve our country, and you basically have to have confidence in your political leadership to get the job done, because once you sign on the dotted line, it's a blank check that you're giving to the government. So we never really got into that. I got into that a lot at St. Mary's College. And that year, when I graduated in the spring of '66, the war was heating up. The Marines hit the beach, ground forces, not advisors, but ground forces, hit the beach in Da Nang in the summer of '65. So this was not even a year later. And in that spring of '66, there were 2 marches about the war, one for and one against. So it wasn't like 2 years later where every college campus in the country was adamantly against. I mean, there were people that were for, but they kept it to themselves. Not politically correct to talk about it, but it was dangerous to put yourself out there. Oh, of course. Yeah, we were gung-ho. We were ready to serve our country. Marine officers, there is a difference between the enlisted and the officer, not only the obvious. One of them is that officers are a lot more tempered in their gung-ho-ness. We're about getting the job done, but we're thoughtful about what needs to get done. It's kind of like the analogy with a pro football team. The coaches are a little more, they're not the ones that run out in the field and are getting all excited before a game. The players are the ones that have to get the job done. The enlisted men are really the ones who take on the enemy in combat. The officers are behind them, orchestrating, controlling, advising, replenishing. There's a big job to do there, but the two functions are very different. Our excitement was tempered. These are gifts I brought back to the States. I got they're extra large, and unfortunately an extra large, not a lot of waistlines fit that. What do we call those bags with the Ziploc bag? With the, this is why they call them Ziploc. Look like a zipper. Actually the trousers I wore in Vietnam. This was the second set I wore out the first. So I got that one towards the end of my tour. And I was there before camouflage utilities were in. Yeah, the summer of '67, when we were at artillery school, we got our orders, and we knew we were going to Vietnam. The comical thing was when we got done with school, we were told that we were given 3 choices of duty assignment. So you listed, and some guys were wise guys in Germany, Hawaii, whatever. And it really didn't matter what you put down. You were going to Vietnam. So some of us put down Vietnam for all 3 choices. I know I put down Vietnam for number 1. It didn't matter. It was quite comical. I was an artillery officer, and I had 3 choices of military occupational specialty, MOS. So I chose artillery as my number 1 choice, and I got it. And I'm very pleased about that, because I was a math guy in college. Summer of '67, there was a song popular by Pet Clark, If You're Going to San Francisco. I had orders to Travis Air Force Base, San Francisco. And I'd sing it to you now, but I know I'd be off key. I'm a singer, but I was singing it last night. I thought, no, this isn't going to work. And so, yeah, that song, we sang it over and over again. We'd rent motor scooters and ride around they were small motorcycles, ride around the mountain singing the song. It was kind of crazy. So we got to Travis Air Force Base, and we had an overnight there. And I got on the plane the next morning and flew out of Travis on my way west. And fortunately enough, I was able, on the right side of the aircraft, out my window, to see the Golden Gate Bridge. So I watched that bridge for as long as I possibly could. I just stared at it for as long as, and then it became a speck, and then it became completely out of view. And I turned in my seat, and I faced forward, and something came over me, like a calmness, like, I'm going to war. There's no turning back. I can't jump off this plane. I'm going. And the calmness, is kind of my spirituality, that I didn't fear going to war because I have a deep abiding faith in God. I didn't know that I would be safe, but I trusted in God and His goodness, and things would work out, and I would do His will. And my goal going to Vietnam was to save as many Marines as I could through the effective use of artillery. So it wasn't like, that gung-ho 18-year-old that wants to go, where are the bad guys? Let's take them out. It was a lot different, because I had a great education, and my education was about serving others, and I felt that this was a call to serve in a different way than a lot of people. Like, there were classmates that went in the Peace Corps. One word in those 2 names are the same, but they couldn't be any different in terms of, they're both service. The Marine Corps' mission is to kill people and break things, okay? It's a stark, cold, hard reality. But we do it for a higher good, a greater good. And that goes back to my roots with my German father. He instilled that sense of patriotism that if you want us to have a strong peace, you need a strong freedom. You need to have a defend our country. And that was my calling. Well, before I went to Vietnam, we landed in Okinawa, and we spent 5 days there. And from Okinawa, the only orders I had were to go to Vietnam. In Okinawa, those orders were fine-tuned. So are you going to the 1st Marine Division or the 3rd Marine Division? And if so, which unit within the 1st Marine or 3rd Marine Division? It got us a chance to get our gear that we would have in Vietnam, some of it. We'd stage certain gear in Okinawa that we couldn't bring forward. And in the course of doing that, I met my best friend, Bill Jarrell, who I met and became best friends with at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. I had 3 best friends in the Marine Corps. They were all killed in combat. My bunkmate, Tim Shorten, in Officer Candidate School, Rich Reynolds was my roommate at the basic school, and Bill Jarrow was my best friend at artillery school. But Bill and I had a few beers one night, and he was leaving the next morning, and we were talking about how we're going to get the job done, we're going to get the bad guys, and we're going to bring victory to this effort. And so I was walking him back to his quarters that night, that evening. He was in one barracks and I was in another. We were standing outside, and I said to him, I shook his hand, and I said, "May God be with you, Bill." And when I looked back at him, I knew I'd never see him again. And I knew it wasn't me. He was killed a week later. The date is September 16th. I took it off the wall when I was in Washington. He was killed by a direct hit of a rocket-propelled grenade when he was in a tower looking for the enemy, and he took a direct hit. So he never suffered, fortunately. So then I went to Vietnam from Okinawa on a C-130. I tried to talk to the guy next to me, and it's so loud that I go, "Hey, Joe, where are you going?" And he'd go, "Oh, I'm going." And we finally gave up on that after about 3 minutes. So we landed in Da Nang. We ran off the C-130. We're got our gear, we're running, and the Air Force guy says, "Hey, what's the hurry? Where are you going?" Said, "Well, we heard you took incoming rocket fire." He said, "Oh, yeah, last week we had around about a half a mile at that end of the runway, at that end of the airport. And let's see, 2 nights ago we had one land about a quarter mile that way." He says, "Slow down, it's going to be a long year." But that goes to the press. The media is always trying to hype things up. And reading this secular press, we thought that there was a lot of rocket fire going around in Da Nang. And so we slowed down. We felt like fools. We got into country, and then I got orders to Foxtrot Battery, F Battery, 2nd Battalion, 11th Marines. And when I was assigned to Fox Battery, 2nd Battalion, 11th Marines, I was attached to 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines Infantry. So I was an artillery officer attached to the infantry as a forward observer. And I replaced Lieutenant Denny Peterson, who was killed. An operation was just ending at that time, Operation Swift. A lot of times when you come in and you take a job, you're taking a job of a person that's been killed, severely wounded, or rotated back to the States. So when I flew out of Da Nang and I landed at Hill 66 near Chu Lai, about 40 miles to the south, I got off the chopper, and immediately it was hot, it was dusty. As a matter of fact, when I landed in Okinawa, I got off the plane and said, "Sauna?" It felt like if you walked into a sauna, it was exactly the same feeling, hot and humid. So when we landed on Hill 66, it wasn't so much humid, but dusty, and I said to one of the guys, said, "What is that terrible smell?" And there were black plastic bags everywhere. And he said, "That's the smell of death." Operation Swift had just ended, and it was one of the most intense battles of the war. Well, there was a lot of trepidation about what's happening here. You got Marines who are going home not the way you want to go home. Again, there was no fear. It wasn't like I was fearless, but I just had a calmness that carried me all the way through Vietnam. And I'm not saying when the stuff hit the fan and we were in a firefight, either ambushed by the enemy or engaged somehow, that I wasn't fearful. But like I tell high school kids when I give a class on Vietnam, I said the initial reaction is startled. Your little sister doesn't scare you. You're not fearful of your little sister, but you're startled. And the startling makes you duck. And then that's when fear sets in. There were a few guys that I trained with at Quantico, Virginia, the Marine School. They were more like Rambo. Hardly any of those guys came back home because they didn't know to duck. But the difference between cowardly behavior and regular behavior is that the cowardly behavior, I don't call them cowards because that's a person thing, the behavioral thing, is that they can't get behind the fear stage. It's that simple. Those of us who didn't act that way were momentarily, okay, this is, I could die doing this. Okay, get my wits about me, what's going on. It's more about getting your wits about you than the fear is a little factor for most of us. So then I would engage. But the beautiful thing for me, it might sound strange talking about war, but when I landed on that hill, I didn't realize that that was the end of an intense battle campaign, which started in April, culminated with Operation Swift in the middle of September of '67. And there's a wonderful book called The Road of 10,000 Pains by Otto Lyric. It's a great read on this has been categorized as the most intense period of conflict in the entire Vietnam War by either the Marines or the Army. We fought the 2nd NVA Division in the Quai San Valley, not Quai San up north, that everybody knows about and gets all the press, but the Quai San Valley. We ran up against the 2nd NVA Division. Our intel said that it was a regiment. We were fighting a division when we thought we were only fighting a regiment. But we ended up destroying that division. And what happened was, with that Operation Swift, the enemy always took 10 times more casualties than we did. They went back into the jungle foothills to reconstitute and reconfigure in anticipation of the Tet Offensive 4 months later. So they were breaking contact with us, which meant a pacified situation for yours truly for the next 4 months. That's one of the key reasons. And I only found out this book on a reunion 3 years ago when I went down to Kentucky. They said, you got to read this book. And I had no idea of the bigger picture of things. And from that, I realized that largely the reason I survived Vietnam is that the Marines who went before me, we took tremendous casualties. The situation was pacified my first 4 months, which gave me the opportunity to get really good at being a forward observer, because I did have to call in missions, but it was on Viet Cong targets, not NVA targets. The big difference between the North Vietnamese regulars and the Viet Cong, I'm trying to think of a good comparison. The Boy Scouts and the Marines and somebody just getting into training. It was stunning because the Viet Cong were farmers by day and warriors by night. Barbers by day, warriors by night. One time, my barber was shaving me, cut my hair, shaving me like this with a straight edge razor. He was found in the wire with an AK-47 with maybe a week later. They tried to infiltrate our lines at night. So, barber by day, warrior by night, and a very elusive enemy. We had a lot of our equipment was World War II, Korean War equipment. Our packs, even the sea rations, the food we ate were left over from. I mean, it was good. It was nutritional, and there's no problem with it, other than it didn't taste good. That's funny. Kind of a funny aside. The officers got to eat last in the field, so I was on 12 combat operations. So I was in the field all the time, and sometimes the men would feel sorry for me and say, "Lieutenant, would you like to have?" Because a favorite meal was like beans and wieners, and one of the worst ones was ham and lima beans. And I was constantly eating ham and lima beans. And one day the guy felt, "Hey, Lieutenant, would you like to have a?" "Yes, please." Matter of fact, there was a transition going on. They were transitioning from the M14 rifle to the M16. And there was big-time problems initially. They should never have introduced the M16 when they wanted to get it in the field because combat was intense. It was superior to the 14 in many ways, lighter. But the one thing the early models were doing were jamming. And so there were Marines dead with a jammed M16 in their hands. The superiority we had over the enemy was we had artillery and air, and the enemy did not have those two supporting arms. They had rockets and 82 millimeter mortars. We had artillery, air, 81 millimeter mortars, 60 millimeter mortars. They had the RPG, rocket launcher, which is still used today, the rocket-propelled grenade. We had the blooper. It was a small grenade launched by a tube maybe about that much in circumference. And it would fire out about 30 meters. It was one of the most feared weapons by the VC. And I didn't think much of the weapon at the time. The problem for the VC was that they would always engage us close. They would throw a hand grenade and it would be short, but the grenade launcher we'd be able to get it a little farther, so it was really good for close combat. The Marines served in I Corps from the DMZ to the north to about Chulai to the south. The Marines in the north fought the NVA, who had artillery that was fired from the DMZ, above the DMZ, although they infiltrated into the DMZ. We didn't go into the DMZ. They did. They were cheating all the time. They didn't have any rules of engagement. We had onerous rules of engagement. And that's one of the things that civilians don't understand when they read the paper today, even about warfare today, about the onerous rules of engagement. Rightfully so. It protects innocent civilians. But the enemy doesn't follow any rules of engagement. They don't follow the Geneva Convention. So imagine the handcuffed effect that has on us. When I got to Vietnam, I didn't mention this, but my first week I didn't get assigned. We ran off the plane, the C-130, but for the next week I was given the rules of engagement to read and the other things that are unique to Vietnam, the Vietnam War. The only thing I did was eat, sleep, and read for a whole week. And I realized right away why they were doing this. The heat is so intense that you cannot function the first couple of days. It's like sitting in a sauna 24/7. After about the third or fourth day, I sat in a GP tent and the heat would emanate down from the tent and there was no fans or anything. It was just always sweating. I carried a towel around my neck, a standard size towel. In combat, I wring it out every 15 minutes. Just like you had the towel in your shower with you and wring it out that was that wet every 15 minutes. That was how intense the sweating was. But once you're adjusted to the heat, which took about a week, it's like second nature. It's like the smells and everything. It's like going into combat on an operation. We dreaded the first 3 days because when we were at the base camp, we got to shower every day. We had a 55-gallon drum with a spigot underneath. It was cold water, but it was clean and we were refreshed. You go into combat, and the first 3 days were problematic. But after the third day, believe it or not, you didn't pay any attention, anybody else or yourself, except for one time we had crossed this river. The enemy pinned us down in the river. I'm going up and coming out. We finally got to the other side of the river. This was that last light. We had to sleep wet, which is, get down to 50 degrees. Wet, are you kidding me? So I dug a hole in the ground, and enough for my body and to be covered, because I had to have a poncho over me, right? So I'm totally confined in there. So I had to choose between freezing and the other stuff, right? So I chose to be warm. Anyway, I'm getting way off the track here. But anyway, that was the equipment that we had, superior to what the Viet Cong had, but equivalent to what the North Vietnamese regulars had. This is a Popular Forces uniform. They were on our side. They were much like our National Guard. That was their uniform. One of the reasons we call them pajamas is that they look exactly like pajamas. And then this is a Chinese communist hand grenade. So this would fly out, and this is the business end of it. Explosive material would be inside that. Hats worn by the enemy. This would actually go with this. Okay. This is our eating utensil. We carried around their belt. Their rice is what their mainstay was. This is a reflection device that the enemy would wear on the back of the cover going down the Ho Chi Minh Trail at night. It's luminescent so that the guy behind him could see the guy in front of him. This is a magazine pouch. So the magazine carries X number of rounds. We had a tremendous problem fighting the enemy. Tremendous. The metaphor or analogy of deer hunting is appropriate. It was as hard to find the VC as it was deer, except the VC were armed and ready to attack us at their choosing. So typically in the 4 months before the Tet Offensive, the Tet is the drawing line because after Tet it became conventional again for a time. It metastasized into full combat, and then it went back into this elusive stuff. But there were actually 2 wars within the within Vietnam in the Marine Corps' area of operation, I Corps. Well north of Da Nang, from way north, HUE, north, was NVA territory. But they were elusive as well. But they would fight with a full platoon of 50 or a company of 150. Whereas in the south, we were fighting two-man teams. And here's a typical situation of what we faced. We'd go through a jungle area in column, it's a technical military term, in column, one behind the other. We broke out in the open. We'd either go to a V formation or a wedge formation or on line. And typically the most common one was V. So you had a point guy and it would be a squad of 13 Marines. So a squad leader and 12 men, 3 fire teams of 4 each. And they would take up 4 and 4 and some other, maybe a pyramid in some cases. And they would go through this open area like this, and a bamboo tree line 20 meters away would all of a sudden open up. So with an automatic weapon, it'd spray back and forth, and you'd instantly have 3 or 4 Marines down, and the rest hunkered down. And that enemy skirmish, they would fire for maybe 30 seconds, and they would be gone. And we were engaging an empty tree line, because they had everything planned out. The route of departure, if you will, to a river. Maybe the river was usually within 100 meters away. They jump in that river. We found this out all after the fact. This was when I got home. So they would be sucking air through a straw underwater, and they would do that and they'd hear the ambient sound underwater. They had the discipline to be under there 2, 3, 4 hours, and until the area cleared, and they would come out. So we would have 0 of the enemy, and they'd have, 2 or 3 or 4, sometimes half a dozen of ours, picking us off like that. So it was very, very difficult to defend. Me as a forward observer, I could have first rounds on the target and still miss them. Very, 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 very difficult in terms of locating the enemy. And they located us. Our footprint was large. You knew when the Marines were coming. Except at night when we set up, we went on patrols. I'm talking about a big operation where you have 450, a battalion-size Marine going through an area. We also had daytime patrols and nighttime patrols that were kind of a loop. So our base camp was here, and they'd loop out, maybe 1,000 meters out and back in all directions, almost like a daisy, flower daisy. And then we would be searching for the enemy in that squad size was a typical configuration for a patrol. As a matter of fact, that my very first action in Vietnam after Operation Swift was to go out with a squad-sized patrol. And the captain said, "Lieutenant, why do you want to go out with," because an officer would never go out with just 13 Marines. And I said, "The only way I'm going to learn how to do my work is to go out and do my work." And he said, "Well, it's your choice to make." So I went out with the squad, and it was a PSYOPs operation. And so the civil affairs guy had a loudspeaker. And he gave it we had a Vietnamese interpreter with us, and he would call out on this loudspeaker, "We are Marines, we are here to help you. Communism is bad, welcome democracy," this kind of thing. And it was receptive to a lot of the people. I mean, the people of the South wanted freedom. They wanted democracy. They wanted us to win, except for the Viet Cong, who were brainwashed by some patriotic endeavor. They didn't understand the nature of communism. And so when the loudspeaker opened up, the enemy did too. That's the first time I saw what cowards do. I mean, the cowardly behavior. These guys were veterans of Operation Swift, a pitched battle with NVA regulars. And they had their head buried in the sand. So I ran by them to call in artillery, and so I got my first taste of combat that way. We went on operations. We faced ambushes. When we had a casualty, a lot of times it was at night, and we'd have to bring in a medevac chopper. And the only way that those chopper pilots would come in at night if it was an emergency medevac. So there was 3 types of medevacs: routine, priority, and emergency. And emergency was life or death. And sometimes we'd raise the priority to an emergency because the guy was going to lose his leg, just to get him out of there, which was I guess it wasn't nice to the pilot. But anyway, the problem with the pilot was we had to turn on our lights just before touchdown, and so he became a sitting duck. And we had some of that stuff. But that was kind of the nature of that 4-month period before Tet. Training, what to look for in a bamboo tree line that was about to open up on you. How to identify more precisely the tripwire, because if you tripped a wire, it would set off an explosive device. Booby traps where you'd fall into a pit and there would be sharp bamboo sticks. It was a crude device, but very effective. You'd go right through the bottom of your boot, because bamboo is really tough and can be made really sharp. So we learned what to look for. Is the vegetation disturbed in some unnatural way, so you can identify that booby trap. Looking very closely for tripwires. So that point man, that very first guy in a column, had the most critical job. One time I decided I was going to be a point man, another dumb thing, but I wanted to be immersed, just like officer candidate school. It immerses you into what it's like to be an enlisted guy. And I wanted to know what those guys went through. So we were going to an observation post, which means that I was going to a lookout in the Broadway. So we were taking a squad of Marines up maybe about 1,500 meters, used Italian submachine guns. So what a submachine gun is good for on the point is it puts out a lot of rounds, but not much range. So if you're attacked, you're going to be attacked within 20 feet of you. So the zip gun kind of thing. So I had one of those. And I walked and I'm looking for all this stuff. And when I got done with that, we got back a couple hours later. I thought, that is one stressful job. But it taught me something that I carried with me for the rest of my life. How do you teach a deer hunter to see the deer better? There's just certain things, techniques you use to, be downwind and that sort of thing. We fine-tuned it as best we could under difficult circumstances. It was preparation for me for TET because I got my sea legs as Marines and Navy. On one of my first little operations, my radio operator knew more than I did because he'd been in the bush for over 6 months. And so I knew the technical issues of artillery that he didn't know, but he knew the call for fire and the order of the call for fire. You identify yourself, Beechnut Foxtrot, this is Seaside 6-2, fire mission, grid, 1, 2, 3, 4, 9, or 7. Direction to the target, 1-200 mils, the nature of the target, and the method of fire. And that's what the call for fire is. Well, when the stuff hits the fan, the enemy's shooting at you. Okay, what is the exact call? So Red was my radio operator. Red Lair was his name. He says, Lieutenant, just give me the grid and the direction. I'll take care of the rest. Perfect. So I had the grid from the map and the direction of the target with my compass, and that was my very first time, and it didn't take me long to get into the flow of things, and just like any job, you don't instantaneously know what the hell you're doing. That's kind of an aside for the most casualties faced by any class from the basic school was the class it was sometime in '67, because they hit the ground just before TET. So they didn't have a chance to get their sea legs. And they were brand new, fresh, green second lieutenants, and the most casualties because they didn't have the benefit I had of getting oriented because of the pacified situation the 4 months before TET. We were much more capable. After a while, my attitude was, and I actually briefed a new incoming infantry company commander, usually captain, who outranked me. I would say captain. Actually, one of the guys is the founder of FedEx, was my company commander. And when Fred came on board, I didn't call him Fred. He was a captain. So I said, Captain Smith, may I give you some advice on artillery? He says, sure. I said, why don't you make contact with the enemy with your Marines and then withdraw, and I'll pound them with artillery. And if the air is available, because the air was unavailable a lot of times because everybody wanted airstrikes. The F-4 fighters were in constant demand. A lot of times they couldn't fly because of fog or weather conditions or rain or pristine conditions. Artillery can fire all the time. So I said, why don't you use this as your modus operandi? I think it's a good strategy. And actually, after the war, it was taken on as a doctrine taught. Captain Smith took me up and he followed my advice. I knew that this guy was going to be something big someday because he was very sharp, he was very collaborative, Sure, he was the boss, but he listened when he could. A lot of times there isn't time. You have to give orders and carry on with things. So I said, well, what are you going to do with your life? He said, well, he says, I kind of like flying. And so, and he talked about this idea he had about freight, delivery of freight. And I said, he said, I don't know if it'll fly or not. And actually, when he went back and got his MBA, he got a C on his paper for the hub system, which he became a billionaire with the FedEx, because the FedEx founded the hub system of delivery of product. Anyway, I'm off on a tangent here like I always do. We worked on our strategizing, and we didn't know what was coming next, but we kind of felt that, this can't go on, this pacified situation. Something's going to happen sooner or later. On January 31st, 1968, I was in the Combat Operations Center as a watch officer. I remember this vividly to this day. It was 4 in the afternoon, 1600 hours. We got a call from division saying 10,000 NVA troops, 20 clicks to 30 clicks to your north. Now a click is 1,000 meters. So they were 20 to 30 miles away, 15 to 20 miles away. And to engage them with artillery. Now as their artillery officer, I had gotten promoted, I didn't mention that. I was promoted to battalion liaison officer. So I had forward observers under me. And I was directly advising the infantry colonel on the use of artillery. I called a battery and they started planting killer crosses, which are it's artillery that runs across a 1,000-meter grid square, and it's designed to take out area. So we did that. We fired that all night long, and we were kind of skeptical because military intelligence is sometimes not. It's not that they're bad in what they do. It's just an extreme art form that and it's to this day what we're facing with ISIS and all. To gather information on what the enemy's up to is definitely an art form and very difficult process to come up with the correct answer. So we were just kind of skeptical about, is this really that big an enemy? We had never. Are you kidding me? So I was still on watch the next morning, and again it was division. They said, we want a company at this grid location. So I had my guy at the map plot the grid, and the grid was 1 click south of the runway at Da Nang, 1,000 meters south of the runway. And this is daylight. I said, this is crazy. We have the wrong grid. Something's wrong. Call the division back. Get the right grid. So he called again. The grid was correct. I said, okay, we've got a large enemy force. It was spotted by an aerial observer doing his job because we had all this intel, so all the eyes were in the sky looking around. We were then ordered to send a company, Indigo Company, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, I Company. Got on choppers and flew up there and landed. And I can still hear the company commander keyed the handset to tell us, it's a sit rep. There's 2 kinds of reports. Sit rep, pos rep, situation report, position report. He keyed the handset and I heard rounds going off in the background. I have goosebumps standing on my neck right now, 47 years later. I said, oh my goodness, what is coming down? So immediately when that happened, they landed in the hot LZ, hot landing zone. The 2-star general, Major General Robinson, called our colonel and said, you go up with your staff, find out what's going on. So I got on the chopper with the colonel, the operations officer, and radio men, probably about 15 of us. We landed on a CH-46 in a hot LZ. So we had rounds. I jumped out of the chopper, and there were rounds coming in. And so we got to a safe spot and figured out what was going on. So to make a long story short, 24 hours later, we had fought a pitched battle with a reinforced VC company of 200 strong. We had an ARVN company on the left flank, a Marine company on the right flank. We defeated the enemy. They couldn't escape. Behind them was a horseshoe-shaped river, and we had Huey gunships with flares illuminating the river, and they were not making it across the river. That was the first battle of the Tet Offensive, and we talk about reacting to the enemy in Tet. This was one of the only battles that I'm aware of. We saw the enemy first and we attacked first because they were caught with their pants down. What happened was, if this is Route 1 and this is the South China Sea, this is Da Nang, we were here, okay? This VC unit was caught in the open. They were supposed to attack at 4 o'clock in the morning at dark, which really would have been problematic. On the west side of Route 1 was the NVA of equivalent size. So 200 NVA over here, 200 VC over here. We're supposed to attack from the line of departure at H hour. The NVA on the left flank had trouble with their VC guides, did not get to the line of departure on time. H hour came and went, and the VC didn't know what to do. So they stayed where they were, and they got caught. And so when we defeated this enemy on the right flank, the enemy on the left flank didn't know what to do because plan is now screwed up. They went back to into villages and hamlets and stirred it up for the poor civilians who were trying to pacify and who loved us for the most part. There were 3 major cities of Vietnam: Hue to the north, Da Nang to the center, and Saigon to the south. All 3 cities were supposed to be hit as hard. Everybody knows about Saigon and Hue and how hard they were hit. You know, the battles of Hue are, everybody knows, who does any kind of history of the Vietnam War knows what happened. The same thing was supposed to happen at Da Nang. The very same thing. It didn't, because we stifled the attack from the south, which was supposed to trigger attacks from the west and the north. And none of that happened. Yeah, I mean, Da Nang got infiltrated by the enemy. Because of our battle to the south, they knew something was up, and everybody was prepared to defend, and defended Da Nang fairly well relative to Hue and Phu Bai. Well, you know, you have to understand that I was a young lieutenant, and I was, you know, microcosmic. So I had my own little fighting world, if you will, and didn't know the big picture of things. I didn't know what the other units were doing, because I was 1 battalion, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. There were probably 20-some battalions fighting in Vietnam, Marine battalions. So those other battalions were fighting the enemy in other locations, and they were the ones who were engaging. The problem, what happened was, after that initial battle for me, is that the enemy now stayed in the hamlets and villages. So now we had to root them out from those places. It's like dealing with ISIS. You know where they're headquartered? They're in homes. Okay, so do we drop a bomb on the home? I mean, it's terrible. It's a terrible circumstance. And the enemy knows that that is their strength. They learned that from the Vietnam War. Some of the insidious stuff that goes on today. IEDs are, you know, an expansion of tripwires. Back in those days, the tripwires triggered a hand grenade as a explosive device. Now it's artillery rounds. Al-Qaeda and the ISIS are using as IEDs. So I really didn't know the bigger picture of who was doing what, but I know after we got done with this battle, the NVA was said to be 3 or 4 clicks away. A regiment of NVA. Well, we were a battalion. So we had role reversal. We now started acting like the VC, and the NVA were acting like the Marines, and the VC were like the Marines and the NVA. So we were told by division to stay in our base camp. You know, you have significant enemy forces around you. Because we weren't ready for this kind of enemy attack. We had some intel, but not enough. So what I did one time was I said to the colonel, I says, I want to send out little 3-4 man teams with my scout forward observer to take on the enemy. So one of the guys, Hunko was his name, he went out and I said, just sit up in a tree line 500 meters outside our wire. And he went out there and he just got all camouflaged up with his radio operator. And he saw he was looking out into a field. It was at a 90-degree angle. I see trees moving from this tree line across to get to the other tree line. I said, well, trees don't move, so you might want to take them on. So he fired a round into an artillery round that landed in the tree line that they were going to, and they stopped. He fired another round and landed in the tree line that they just came from. They stopped. They were frozen in the middle of the field. And he fired for effect with a VT fuse round, which is VT, variable time. A lot of people think of the Vietnam War as Middle Ages. We were quite sophisticated. The variable time fuse has a radio transmitter receiver. When it's fired out of the howitzer, it's sending its own signal to itself. It only receives its own signal when it gets 20 meters above the deck. So when it gets 20 meters above the deck, it receives it, and when it receives its own signal, it explodes. It always explodes 20 meters over the deck. To make a long story short, for the next couple of weeks, that's the way we operated. We operated clandestinely. We We had to secure our base camp. The enemy never attacked us in our base. That would have been foolhardy because we had triple concertina wire. We had overlapping fields of fire, and I think they knew that. Their idea, the whole idea of the Tet Offensive in the mind of the enemy, was to get on the American TV set at back home. Because they weren't interested in attacking our base camp. They were interested in getting into Da Nang, disrupting the normal flow of life, and getting blood and guts in that camera to send back to the American people. And mission accomplished. Like I say, I fought in 12 combat operations plus Tet. And the reason I use the plus sign is that the Tet Offensive was the enemy's offensive. That was the other 12 were named. Operation Shelbyville was my very first. Operation Swift is the one I came in on. I fought in Allenbrook in the summer and Mameluke Thrust just before I went home. So our operations were always named. We didn't have a name for the Tet Offensive because it was the enemy's operation. There was no doubt in our mind that we felt this euphoria over victory. That battle where he killed 102 and captured 88, we had 2 Marines killed and about 6 wounded. The ARVN had about twice that many, about 4 killed. The casualty rate was at least 10, sometimes 20 to 1, all throughout the Tet Offensive. This hardly ever gets any press. It was very discouraging for us to see LBJ, then Baines Johnson, who I have tremendous disdain for, as Commander-in-Chief. He did wonderful things on the civil rights side, but he was a terrible Commander-in-Chief. Micromanaging the war from the White House, plotting targets in Hanoi from the White House. Are you kidding me? I mean, even 4-star generals don't do that. 2-star generals don't do that. That's the job of colonels and below. So when we heard reports, and we didn't get much, the only news we got was through the filter of the newspaper called Stars and Stripes, which was the military's. And really it was, and I mean this with all tenderness to the military and the government, it was a propaganda piece. It was to build our morale. And there was no lies in there. It just didn't tell the full story. Well, we get the same thing in our press today. Oops, did I say that? You get half stories, and when you get a half story, you don't know the whole picture, right? I mean, it's common sense. So we didn't know really what was going on. Well, we did hear when LBJ came out on television and said that we saw it of ourselves, that he's not running for president because, basically he listened to Walter Cronkite, and Walter Cronkite said the war was lost, therefore it is, kind of the media running the show. That was the beginning of an awful period which continues to this very day. From our perspective, we felt that, boy, we're gonna take the war to them now, because, and if we had a commander-in-chief who had some chutzpah, we would have taken the war to them. Just a couple of things about the terrible tactics that were used, not because of military, but because of an inept commander-in-chief. We never attacked the North in their weakness. The Marines make amphibious landings for a living. We never attacked the North. We could have attacked a place of our choosing, because when you win in battle, it's because you surprised the enemy, you had overwhelming force, and did things they didn't expect you to do. If we had attacked with just a regiment, 3 battalions, 1,400 Marines, made an amphibious landing, surprise attack, and went to their truck parks and destroyed all their trucks, which now could not go down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. We were bombing the Ho Chi Minh Trail, 50 feet, 100 feet of jungle canopy, and the trucks were kind of shaken up, but they were still good to go. We knew when they were starting there, we had the sophistication of sensors to know when they were starting their trucks in the parks in North Vietnam. We could have taken out with airstrikes, but it wasn't in the agenda of the political leadership. It was ridiculous. And rather than 58,000, I've talked to many Marine officers over the last 40 years. We have calculated that no more than 10,000. That's almost 50,000 American young men, and it was all men that fought. We had some nurses and I remember Red Cross workers that came, but it was back in those years. It was some in the rear, but very, very few. Those who came back from Vietnam 30 years ago, 40 years ago, when it was full fresh, the press had it that everybody coming back from it was drug-addled, and suffering a severe case of PTSD. But it might come as a surprise, I know it is when I give in classes to people, is that I'm not that atypical of a Marine that came back and has made a successful life and raised a family and all that sort of thing. But those 40,000 can't. Well, like I said before, the enemy was working in small teams to take out our lead element, and they were okay with taking out a few people. The reason why Tet was planned by the enemy is that they knew they were losing the war. They knew they had to do a better job than just take out a few Marines here and there. Because when they were taking out 2 of us, we were taking out 200 of them in a rear area back in the mountains or whatever it might be, or pitched operations. They were getting attrited big time. The reason why they needed 4 months to prepare for Tet is that they had to go back, the 2nd NVA Division, as that book I mentioned to you, The Road of 10,000 Pains indicated. The title of the book, the subtitle is The Destruction of the 2nd NVA Division. This is 10,000 enemy strong. It was completely destroyed. You had nothing but killed and wounded, and equipment destroyed. So it took them all that time, and the General Giap in the north knew full well that this is not going well. We have to make an impact. They knew the nature of democracies. They knew they took advantage of our weakness. They knew that the American people were not up to a lot of blood and guts. And so they brought the blood and guts to the American people vis-a-vis the Tet Offensive. It was a brilliant move, brilliant on the part of the enemy. You got to give credit where credit's due. They planned for a long time what they were going to do. Tens of thousands of enemy soldiers, all poised. That's one of the things that the enemy did so very well, is if they were going to attack our base camp, they would spend 3 to 4 months in the jungle. They'd have every single detail that was contained in that base camp, because they had their own intel. That barber that was shaving and cutting my hair, he was intel. He'd make a mental note of, okay, they've got a bunker here, they've got an automatic weapon here, they've got a pillbox there, they've got mortars over there. And then they'd go back and they'd configure all this, and it would take, I'm not exaggerating, 3 months to plan an attack. See, the enemy owned the night, we owned the day. So when they attacked, they always attacked at night because we couldn't use our strength, air especially. Artillery was still available, but a forward observer seeing at night, what am I seeing? I'm seeing darkness, right? Now, if I illuminate, what's that going to do? I'm illuminating my own position as well as the enemy's. So strategically, and I don't know specifically how they configured their units, that one VC guide, he probably got hung the next day because, and I don't know who's at fault here, but the VC guide not getting his act together with the NVA is what caused us to be victorious. Right after Tet, our job was to open up Route 1 for the 101st Airborne. Because what we realized is we didn't have enough soldiers, Marines, to take care of a larger enemy force that was fully exposed during Tet. Because they were bigger than we were. They were coming at a battalion with a regiment. So that's 5 to 1 in their favor. So we needed more people, and we didn't have the lift, because the 101st Airborne is an air mobile brigade. We didn't have that kind of capability. So they came through us, and we're road guards from Da Nang, the Highland Pass north to Phu-Bai, which is just south away. We opened up that whole road. So we were road guards for this big Army unit coming through. I can still taste the red dust and grit in my teeth. So that was pretty much what happened. What we did was we set up in this village. In the village, we asked the village chief their permission to occupy be a part of the fabric of their community for a while. I had to get my equipment out of the rain. It was raining all the time. We had radios that were vulnerable to that. So I asked this one Vietnamese man if we could use the porch area, which was maybe 4 feet wide by about 12 feet long. And so we set up our sleeping bags and stuff there, and that's where we lived for 2 weeks. So it happened to be during Lent. I'm a Catholic. This was actually, ironically enough, a Catholic hamlet with a Catholic church. And it was a brick church. It was like this church landed from Mars, because there were nothing but grass hooches all around Vietnam, except for the French Catholics built these churches. I knew that the family was Catholic because they were saying the rosary. When the Catholics at that time were saying the rosary every day during Lent. Most Catholics, including me. What they did was Mama San, the mother, was kneeling on the bed, a hardwood bed, and Papa San, I think they had like 4 kids, were kneeling around the bed. And they had one rosary. And Mama San had the rosary. I've never seen a rosary like this. It was in like 6 different pieces. I mean, this isn't a full-blown rosary. This is a small one. But you'd finish one. You know how the rosary is. There's little beads. You say a Hail Mary, you move on to the next Hail Mary. So she's saying these, and I'm saying, man, she's unreal. She has to deal with 6 pieces. I've always taken one rosary for granted here, I guess. A lot of things you learn when you're immersed in a third world country about what you've been taking for granted. It's a wonderful learning experience. War is terrible, but the learning experience was great. At the end of this 2-week period, I thought, I'm going to give Papa San one of my rosaries. My wife sent me a rosary. My mom sent me a rosary. I had a friend that said, I had like 6 rosaries. I mean, I can only say one at a time. So I picked out a really nice rosary that somebody sent, and I presented it to Papa San the last day. Now, I was not prepared for this reaction. He just broke down. It was like I had given him gold doubloon, pieces of gold. It's really profound. Anyway, so that was, so I thanked him for allowing us to be there with him. And so after that stay, we moved up to Fubai. We were just basically waiting for the higher-ups to figure out what to do in reaction to it, because this was a game changer. That was not only strategically for us, for the president trying to figure stuff out, and the commander-in-chief, I should say, same guy but different role. Next phase was the summer of 68. My Vietnam War experience in 3 separate categories: pre-Tet, post-Tet, and then the terrible summer of 68. We were really in for it when we left Fubai, and we did a long road march from Fubai all the way back down to south of Da Nang to a place called An Hoa, about 30 miles from the Laos border. And from there we conducted operations Allenbrook and Mameluke Thrust. The summer of 68 was just awful. We didn't have fresh water most of the time. We were using well water that looked like, I liken it to the rivers up in Alaska from the melting glaciers, kind of a gray-colored water. It was purified with a halazone tablet, but the taste was absolutely awful. One of our very first battles was we took the place of a reserve battalion that was relieved. I actually have the map 40 years later and the notes from what they did. We arrived June of 68 to relieve a reserve battalion sent from the States during Tet. This reserve battalion tried to take number 2 on my map, a hamlet maybe about 100 meters across an open area to a hamlet. Take number 2 4 to 5 times. I wrote this right afterwards, so I don't have to rely on my memory. Without air support artillery. He was a World War II guy. A lot of the World War II guys didn't have the luxury of having artillery and air, and we had both, but he never used either. So the next morning, we, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, moved into number 2 without resistance. Because I prepped the target, I called in artillery. We didn't need airstrikes, but I called in significant artillery. Killed the enemy or they were gone. We mopped up, I hadn't used that term in a long time, mopped up and moved out to number 3, which was another hamlet, under a prep fire. Prep fire is preparation fire, where before you attack, you call in artillery to soften the target. That does a pretty good job of softening the target. We got pinned down at number 3, and we were out in the sun, 110 degrees for 4 hours. Finally, the lead platoon advanced, and we were able to get across the river. At number 4, we were pinned down again, but now the situation was critical since most of us were out of water and no way for chopper to bring in supplies. The heat was devastating, and I was one of the last to have water, handing it out to those who needed it most. I saved one Marine's life by giving him mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, as well as the water. This is the canteen story, as I like to call it. What happened was I carried 2 hand grenades here and 2 hand grenades in my pack, and 2 canteens of water. This is the canteen I used, and carried quite a bit of water. I had 2 of those. I mean, water is always in short, and you're sweating all the time. So I thought, we were way down, and I didn't have room for all this gear, and I knew I needed more water. So I thought, if they get to me, with the hand grenades they get to me, I'm not going to need the hand grenades, because it's going to be close combat. I'm going to need my K-bar. You know, what am I going to do, knock them over the head with the hand grenade? So I gave my hand grenades away, and I took on 4 more canteens of water. I had 2 in the front, 2 in the back, and 2 in my pack. I had a small forward observer team. An infantry second lieutenant has responsibility for 1 rifle platoon. That's 50 Marines. I was an artillery forward observer. My expertise was in map reading. The company commander always expected me to know where I was and to tell him so he could tell the company. Using the binoculars, judging where the enemy was, and using artillery effectively, calling in artillery rounds. My men, when I say my men, I'm talking about 4 guys. Radio operator for me, scout who knew forward observer work like me but didn't know all about all the other things about artillery. And he had a radio, so we had 4 guys. So they were giving me a bad time about this. He said, Lieutenant, what are you carrying all this water for? I said, you know, you just never know. Well, sure enough, I was the last one out of 120 to have water. And I was in control of that water. Only way you got water, not heat exhaustion, but heat stroke. Heat exhaustion is not life-threatening. Very distinct differences between heat exhaustion and heat stroke. So I was divvying out to those who were going into heat stroke. I was the only one with water for the last at least hour and a half. So finally we had F-4 Phantoms come in and drop 250-pound, we called them napes and snakes, napalm and snake eyes. That was that summer of 68. The enemy had taken over Ganoi Island. We called it Indian country. We called it the Arizona Territory, which was India country. They had a labyrinth of tunnels, underground tunnels. It was stunning. The reason we couldn't get into this village, even though we were calling in artillery, is that they had significant underground bunkers. So they'd hear the aircraft coming, and they'd get down. Sometimes they didn't hear artillery coming. But they did too. They knew that you could hear the rounds coming in. They'd come out and they were, now ready to fight again. That's why we couldn't get into some of these places. A year later, they bulldozed the entire island. They came in with these big engineering crews. The United States did, and just tunnels down to nothing. Because we finally figured out what they were doing for a long time. When we were fighting the battles, we didn't know where they went, because they were so adroit covering up the tunnels, the openings to the tunnels. Right, Mamluk thrust began in the late summer of '68. It was a large regimental operation, so our little piece of it was starting at last light. We decided to do something quite different that the enemy was not used to, and we fully utilized, for one of the first times in the war, our element of surprise with a big operation, something totally unexpected. We crossed a large river at last light, and Amtraks, so they're called amphibious tractors. About 80% of the vehicle is submerged in the water. It's kind of like a square tank-looking thing. They're called Amtraks, amphibious tractors. The whole battalion crossed the river in amphibious tractors, and we landed on the other side of the river. It was last light, able to see enough to get on the ground and start moving. And we moved out along a rice paddy dike parallel to the river, and then we made a right turn and moved into a hamlet about maybe 300 meters away as we followed this rice paddy. As a forward observer at night, I needed to be close. So we had 450 man battalion, and I was in the first 25 people. If I was going to be effective at all with artillery, I had to be able to somewhat know what's going on. Otherwise, I'd be completely useless. What artillery does at night, it does, primary mission is to illuminate. Now, if you're on an operation, you're trying to find the enemy at night, and they're in a village, and you're exposed on a rice paddy dike out in the middle of nowhere, and I illuminate your position, would that be a good thing? Probably not. Illumination was out. HE, high explosives, or white phosphorus rounds could have worked as long as we were at least 50 meters from the village. So that's where I was positioned in this column, walking this rice paddy dike. Well, I'm not more than 20 meters from that ville when the first man walks in. All of a sudden, all hell breaks loose. I hear M16 going off, which is ours, thank God. About 3 minutes later, an RPG is fired at the Marines behind me. I immediately duck. I'm startled. It's all these flashes at night. I duck, and I said, okay, do I have a job to do here? No, too close. They're right on top of each other. All of a sudden, it got quiet. And we reconfigured, and the word spread that what happened was our point guy walked right into a VC. Now, the only people at night are NVA. This guy was a two-man guide team. So he was guiding the NVA, North Vietnamese regulars, probably a unit of 100 enemy, from checkpoint A to checkpoint B. So at checkpoint B, the enemy would be given a compass reading and the number of meters to the next checkpoint. That's how the enemy that didn't know the terrain moved throughout, because they owned the night, remember. And so they walked from checkpoint to checkpoint. So what this enemy soldier thought of our point man was, you're an NVA. So he said, Chow Am. Chow Am means hello, sir. He suddenly realized when the Marine pulled back, he came down to do what he had to do with his M16, hit him on the shoulder. He had to step back to finish the job. So it was only a two-man team, so it might have been more than that, because one guy ran out on the flank and fired at our rear with an RPG, rocket-propelled grenade. But it was a very short duration firefight. That was a pretty sudden start to Operation Mammoth Thrust. The next morning, we moved out and we walked probably about 7,000 to 8,000 meters. I'm probably about 200 meters behind the lead element, and I hear a rat-tat-tat-tat of both enemy and American forces, so we are engaged. So what I found out is that our first squad went down into this ditch. There was a creek at the bottom of the ditch. They went down maybe about 20 feet down and then crawled up the other side. And as soon as they threw a leg over, get up on the embankment, an automatic weapon would open up and stop. So we couldn't even get on line to attack a bamboo tree line that was about 20 meters from the edge of this ditch. There was no way that our infantry was going to get in there. And remember our modus operandi with Captain Smith to say, establish contact with the enemy and we'll hit them with supporting arms. And that's exactly what happened. And thankfully they weren't able to get in there because we would have had more Marine casualties. So I began to engage them with artillery, and the forward air controller, who was right next to me, began to engage them with airstrikes. Now air is very unpredictable, just not available because everybody wanted it or the weather conditions weren't right or whatever. But artillery was always available. So I developed a strategy to attack because I knew this was going to be a long engagement, because this is the first time in almost 12 months the enemy stayed and fought. They were protecting something. So we had to really attack that. I could not see the target. There was a huge bamboo tree line and other vegetation in front of me. So I said, how am I going to do this? I decided that I was going to do it by map inspection. I'd call a white phosphorus round. The smoke lingered so I could see where it was. Other HE round, high explosive, explodes and then you don't see it anymore. So I decided to use white phosphorus. See, when you fire a 6-gun battery, it's in a sheaf, a W, extended W sheaf, and they're about maybe 20 feet apart. Each gun is 20 feet apart. So when you fire them, all 6 rounds land in that same sheaf, right? Okay. So it's a broad sheaf. What I want to do is narrow the sheaf. So I took, rather than 6 guns, 1 round, I took 2 guns, 3 rounds. The same number of rounds, but I figured I'd have more target coverage, because if you fire 3 rounds out of 1 tube with the exact same elevation and deflection, they're not going to land precisely because they're fired at 8,000 meters. They're going to land, one's going to land here, one's going to land 5 feet away, and I'm going to have really good target coverage. That was my theory. It was an elongated village of about 200 meters by 400 meters. We were long on the gun target line, which means that the guns were firing from the other side of the ville, 8,000 meters over there, and if a long round happened, it would hit us. I'd go right, make sure the adjustment round was on the target. I'd say, okay, fire for effect. Fire for effect means fire all 6 rounds. So 2 guns, 3 rounds. I know where they landed because I asked the battery to give me the replot grid. This gets a little technical, but important to know. The replot grid means that that's the data that they just fired. Because all I do is go right 50 or right 50 meters or left 50 meters. I don't know where that is on my map because I gave them the initial grid. I don't know how it's evolving. I keep moving it around, right 50, because I do more right and left because down was towards where we were. So to make a long story short, I fired 400 rounds using this technique I developed. I developed the technique, the replot grid, because when they gave me the replot grid, I'd say, okay, we're way too far over here to the right side of the village. I got to move it to the left. They'd give me a 10-digit grid, and with a protractor, I'd be able to pinpoint exactly where they hit and then be able to adjust from there. Because I couldn't see anything. I had to adjust from feel. The battle ended. The next morning, we walked into the target area. There were craters everywhere, every 5 feet. The enemy had trenches this wide, and about 6 feet deep. And they were very little people. You'll see from the uniforms they have out there. Their waist was like this. There were craters within the trenches. My radio operator called me and says, Lieutenant, you got to see this. Well, I said, I can't come over there. He says, we found a dead NVA major in the bunker, unscathed. He was killed. The last 50 rounds that we fired were 155 ammunition, which is used to this day, and that's a much higher caliber than the 105 howitzer. I have his badge right there. That's an NVA major's badge. That ended a major battle. We had a brand new lieutenant colonel, battalion commander. He had no idea what he was seeing when he walked through the target area because he didn't know artillery. He didn't realize what had just been accomplished. He went, oh, this is kind of nice. And I'm going, are you kidding me? That night, we had to hunker down. This actually goes to my Puff the Magic Dragon story. When we were not able to marry up after this battle, we could not get back with our main unit. There was a 300-meter sandbar. So we had to stay there overnight. Well, this is when the enemy operates. So we knew we were going to be in a S sandwich, S blank blank T sandwich. And that's a terrible term. We called for support that night. So one of the supporting mechanisms, if you were pinned down at night, affectionately called Puff the Magic Dragon. Puff the Magic Dragon was a C-47 gunship, big plane, that carried a computerized minigun. This minigun fired 1,000 rounds per minute. As soon as last light hit, we started hearing movement all around us. I thought, oh my God, there's hundreds of them. We called for Puff. Puff came on station. The pilot called down to the forward air controller, who was standing right next to me. He said, take a flashlight, turn the flashlight down, put it down a mortar tube, and put the mortar tube at the center of your position. So, if it's 100-meter diameter, 50-meter radius, right to the center where you are, and point it up to me. So he took that pinpoint light and he says, okay, what is the radius from that light to your lines? And we said, about 20 meters. So he added a fudge factor, a safety factor, and he said, okay, stand by. And within 2 minutes, this inverted cone of fire from that plane, and a machine gun goes, this sounded like, it was amazing. Every 5th round is a tracer, and it looked like an endless stream of fire coming down. And as soon as that happened, he only did it about 3 times circumference-wise, silence. And about an hour later, it started again. He stayed on station all night long. One plane relieved another. There's several reasons why I'm here today. That's one of them. Puff the Magic Dragon saved my and the lives of about 100 Marines. We were able the next day to marry up with our unit. We stepped back to our base camp at Anwa. Then that was my last operation. And the command at that time was concerned about being a casualty within 2 weeks of your going home because it was creating bad press at home. Joe Blow, the Marine, was killed 2 days before he went home. You know how awful that is, and it is awful. It's awful anytime. I was pulled out of the field 2 weeks before I was to rotate home. And in that 2-week period, my only job was to keep myself safe and eat chow and sleep. That was it. It was wonderful. And for the first time, literally, in 12 and a half months, I was thinking of my own safety, that I might actually get home. I built up my own bunker, my crude bunker. I had sandbags that were, kind of 2 here and 4 there, and they're half filled. And I dug it down about 3 feet, enough for me to hold me. There weren't a lot of humorous things, but there was some humor. One of the humorous things that happened to me was in that last 2-week period. My replacement had checked in. So he was a brand new green. His uniform was, very green. Mine was kind of a dull green. So we took incoming one night. So I was in the bunker like in 10 seconds. I knew what that was. It was not friendly fire. Well, he didn't come for at least 5 minutes. I said, where is this guy? So finally he was in the same general purpose tent that I was at the other end of the tent. So finally he's huffing and puffing, and I said, where were you? He says, I was trying to find my magazine to shove into my M16, and it turned out to be my bar of soap. So he finally found his magazine, found his way to the bar. I said, oh my gosh, you're going to have me along here. This is how you're going to behave. Yeah. So that was kind of my final little experience in Vietnam, and a couple of days later I was on a CH-53 chopper on my way back to Da Nang to fly out the next day to Freedom Land, or as we called it, the world. We had to dye all of our white underclothing and our handkerchiefs, and we had to put our name on everything. It was good to have a kind of a cheat sheet to remind us as to how to put together that 5-paragraph order when you're in combat. This is a water buffalo tooth. This is actually a pack of matches that I brought back from Da Nang, Vietnam. These are almost 50 years old, never been struck. This is a 50 caliber round. This is the business end of the round. Piece of shrapnel, high caliber artillery round. Again, the enemy owns the night, we own the day. So we would set up a 360-degree perimeter with interlocking bands of fire. So you'd have a Marine here, 20 meters later another Marine, and you'd interlock. So you'd have sticks actually placed on the left and right parameter, so you wouldn't hit your fellow Marine. So when your weapon came over and hit the stick, you knew you were at your right limit. And they would interlock. So we had the whole 360 was interlocked by fire if the enemy attacked. My job as an artillery forward observer at night, preparing for our night defensive, I would plan night defensive fires. So let's say there was a ditch here where the enemy could come in, and let's say there's a little hill over here. While the men were digging their foxholes, I would call in a white phosphorus round about 100 meters out and actually move the round. You call the mission into the battery, and your first round is off, so you move the, I'd say left 5-0, add 5-0, and register that as a target. So I would register about 4 targets around my perimeter. And the reason for that is if the enemy attacked at the night, I didn't want to get my compass out, my flashlight, my binoculars, I didn't need binoculars, but all of this would be very cumbersome. I wouldn't have rounds on the target for 5 minutes. They could overrun us. When I registered these 4 targets in the ditch and on the hill, they would be registered as a target number. So that target, the ditch would be Alpha Bravo 1001, the hill would be Alpha Bravo 1002, 1003, 1004. So if we were probed this way, I'd get on the hook and say, fire Alpha Bravo 1001. And that took what, 10 seconds. And so that's what my job was. A lot of times on an operation, the only time us officers and staff non-commissioned officers had time to even breathe was at last light, because the men were set up with their defensive positions. You were just waiting, hoping the enemy wouldn't attack, and then crapping out for the night, as our slang term was. Well, I wanted to know this one staff non-commissioned officer. He was about 32 years old. He was in the service about 12 years. He was an old man, but he was quiet. He never said much. So I wanted to get to know him, because a lot of times I found in life still waters run deep. We had about a 5 or 10 minute conversation. I excuse myself. You never set up your sleeping bag near somebody else. So I was on the other side of this knoll. And within 5 minutes of me getting over there, and I was just getting down to lay down, I heard enemy incoming mortar. So I got all the way down, and I heard this explosion. I said, oh my God, that was close. I waited a few minutes to make sure that there wasn't another one, and there wasn't. But I waited about 5 minutes. I got up, and I went to inspect, because I knew it landed within our wire. When I got around that knoll, the round landed precisely where myself and the staff non-commissioned officer were standing. 2 colors were distinct, the color red and the color white. And they were in the trees and the bush and all around me. And white fluffy stuff, that was the sleeping bag. And the red was, we know what that was. There's a slang term called blown away. Somebody was blown away, meaning killed. That actually can happen if it's a high caliber enough round. This is kind of nitty gritty, but reality. He was gone. There were hardly pieces to send home in a body bag. We didn't need a body bag to send home the pieces to Mom and Dad. So why was I spared that night? Another point of being spared on a firefight, a small arms round. I felt this whoosh by my ear, just kind of like when you go by a semi, you feel like a concussion or a void or a vacuum. I said, wow, that had to be close. After I got back from the States, I did some research that I found out if you feel a round going by you, it's got to be within 1 inch of your, whatever body part, whether it's in your hand or. So that round was 1 inch from within 1 inch of my right ear. One time we crossed the river at dusk. The lead element was under fire, and I happened to be in the river when the lead element was under fire. And the rounds were landing in the river, and I was coming up. Got on the other side of the river. Fortunately, we didn't take any casualties in the river. And I set up for the night, and that's when I had to spend the night wet that I had mentioned before. That was somewhat harrowing. And then the last harrowing experience that I can remember is we crossed a river. It was in a jungle operation, and the only time that you can see through jungle canopy is where the rivers are. The military, in their gathering intelligence via helicopters and light aircraft, was they would follow the river up the mountain, down the mountain, whatever, because they could see all the way down to where people might be. Well, we were crossing this river. I always remember looking off my left shoulder and seeing this cigar-shaped helicopter coming at us. The Marine Corps has the Huey, which the Army has. It has a CH-46. The Army has the equivalent of a CH-47, pretty much the same plane. We had the Cobra. They didn't have the Cobra. When you looked at it coming at you, just no profile. So very little target for the enemy to shoot at. So two of these came in and strafed us. They made 2 runs at us. Oh, the Army had Cobras. So what am I talking about? The Army, because they were Army Cobras, not Marine Cobras. The forward air controller, we knew they were friendlies because the enemy didn't have helicopters way that far south. So the forward air controller is switching frequencies on his radio, trying to find him. And finally, he found the right freak, and he called him off. So it was friendly fire. We didn't take a single casualty. I have no idea why. And as soon as we crossed that river, maybe about 10 meters into it was a rice cache and a weapons storage area and an outdoor classroom under jungle cover. They made up their own cover as well. We didn't have much military interaction because on that one we were coordinated with the ARVN company. They worked pretty much autonomously on the left flank. We had a clear parameter between our line and theirs. So they worked on the left flank, we worked on the right flank. There was no military to military coordination at my level. A young officer with kind of a microcosmic look at the war. The ARVN, Republic of the Army of Vietnam, were our allies. I didn't have much interaction with them. But the civilians, I had some interaction with because we protected hamlets. We protected 2 bridges, a bridge north of the High Van Pass for 2 weeks. Initially, when I first got there, the Camley Bridge, the key bridge south of Da Nang. Well, that bridge had to be protected at all costs because without it, we couldn't move north-south. So in the process of protecting that bridge for 2 weeks, we had a Marine platoon. My job was to coordinate day and night defensive fires of the bridge. I had to wash my laundry one day. So I go down the stream, and all the little kids, were always looking for, you were a number 1 Marine if you gave them candy. We'd always want to give them everything we had if we could. We wanted to enhance their morale. We were attempting to win hearts and minds of the people, to help them to understand that we were the good guys here. So we'd all be constantly giving out things to the kids. So you were a number 1 Marine if you gave them something. If you didn't have anything, you were number 10 Marine. Sorry about that. What we did was, with our washes, I had a little box of Tide soap, and we took our helmet and take the helmet liner out, and the helmet was like a bowl. Take the water down the stream and add a little Tide to it, and I'm just beginning, and I'm interacting with kids. I'm bantering back and forth with kids. This young Vietnamese woman, Chow Ba and Co. Ba is a woman of age, mature woman, usually married with kids. Co is a young woman, teenager, but a young woman between probably 15 and 20. And they always wore these white dress-like things from all the way down to their ankles. And they were beautifully dressed. And so she came up and she didn't say a word. Takes my helmet, discards the box of soap, goes down to the river, and she's doing this like a washboard. I've never seen anything. I didn't know your knuckles could move that fast. She's rubbing away on and I'm interacting and having fun with the kids. 10 minutes later, she brings my laundry back all, wrung out. Never said a word. I didn't know any Vietnamese. I didn't know. It was beautiful. So, the other interaction was the rosary story. So both interactions were, and that 2 weeks that rosary story where we were, after the Tet Offensive, we were in this Catholic hamlet. I'd play games with the kids. I'd be in my white boxer shorts. Nobody cared. It was boxer shorts. It was so hot. It was like our regular shorts. I was playing cowboy and Indian with him. I had my 45 strapped to my waist, and I gave him a cartridge belt. I didn't give him the weapon. Well, actually, he did have the gun. He didn't know bullets. And so we're bantering back and forth. Who can draw faster? When we did interact with the civilians, we really wanted them to understand that we were human beings just like them. We were there to win their freedom. And most of the South Vietnamese were used to, they had a dictatorship, but they had the freedom of religion, they had the freedom of speech, they had the freedom of assembly. I knew, and we all knew, that under communism that would not happen. And when the South won the war in April of '75, that's exactly what happened. A real quick thing. The Viet Cong soldiers that fought alongside the NVA soldiers in the victory parade in downtown, formerly Saigon, now Ho Chi Minh City, they were not allowed to march. That's what communism is. They just threw away their ally. Because they would not have won the war without the VC guides, without the VC help. Said, you're discarded like old trash. Now we're in charge. The North Vietnamese Army and the North Vietnamese. Very distinct look into the nature of a communist dictatorship. And this is my rank as a lieutenant colonel. These are the dress blues. These two are Vietnamese awards. Vietnamese campaign, that's the fact that the country of South Vietnam gave us this award for helping them defeat communism, or attempting to. This is the Vietnamese Cross of Gallantry with Silver Star. This is a decoration I earned in combat. It came with a Silver Star and a Bronze Star, and I won the Silver Star. This is the Vietnamese Service Medal. This is an American medal. Each one of these 4 stars represents a medal in itself. So I won 5 stars because of the intense combat at the time. This is the National Defense Ribbon. Every military person, after they go through training, has that. And then this is my the Reserve, Marine Corps Reserve Medal. This is the Combat Action Ribbon. This is the one I'm most proud of because it indicates that I was in combat. And then this is the Presidential Unit Citation. This is another big one with 1 star. Commander-in-Chief awarded this to 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines for valor in combat as a unit. And over here are more, but these are my shooting badges. I was a rifle marksman and a pistol expert. This is for rifle marksman and pistol expert. Everyday uniform, actually, I didn't wear in Vietnam. This is when I wore in the reserves. To include socks and t-shirt and cover. The last 2 weeks, it was me. I didn't interact with anybody except at the chow hall to eat, because I didn't have a functional role to play. It wasn't like they rejected me. It was just, Roger's in his tent, Lieutenant Reitman's in his tent, reading his stuff. And you get to become a human being, so I kind of interacted with the troops in a way I hadn't before. Not because you're something better or special. It's just that you have a job to do, they have a job to do. And you have to have some separation between supervisor and subordinate. That's a healthy thing. When I went down to Da Nang and I stayed overnight at the barracks getting ready to fly out the next morning, the F-4 Phantoms were taking off for sorties over North Vietnam all night long, so I didn't get very much sleep. But I didn't need to sleep. I knew I was on a Freedom bird the next morning. I either flew on a World Airways or Pan Am flight. And I remember to this day walking up the gangway and into the plane. There was a stewardess there to greet us. I went, oh my gosh. The last time I saw a round eye, what we called American women round eyes, was a Red Cross worker just before Tet came down to this bridge we were protecting. And I mean, we couldn't take our eyes off them. I mean, we didn't have to look at anything but their face. They were so, because the Vietnamese people, the slant eyes just weren't all that, which is a good thing for us young Marines. Anyway, we got on the plane. Stewardesses were on the plane to greet us, to welcome us. Everything was clean and immaculate, lights, all the things that we were used to and hadn't seen for 13 months. I mean, it was just an awesome feeling, a really awesome feeling. When I got on the plane, we flew out, and I want to share this one significant thought I had. And this was a culmination of my whole year. And the thought came out in one thought. We were flying east, obviously. I looked over I was on the left side of the plane. I could see the whole coastline all the way up to North Vietnam. And this thought instantly went into my head. This place will be North Vietnam's tomorrow. I knew what LBJ had done. I knew he backed off from the Tet Offensive. I knew the nature of the ARVN military, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. I had a couple of lieutenants that I served with in training in Quantico, and one was Lieutenant Mon. And Lieutenant Mon wanted to do two things. On Friday nights, he wanted to go to Washington, D.C., to the JAPA mixer, where there would be American female secretaries. JAPA was Junior Officer Professional Association. That was Friday nights. Every Friday night in Washington, that was the deal. If you were a young officer, women wanted to meet officers, right? When they found out you were going to Vietnam, it was like, is my breath smell bad or what? Quite comical in a way. Not at the time. And the other thing they wanted to do is they wanted to go to Mary Washington University on Saturday night. This is what Lieutenant Mon wanted. He didn't care about military training or anything. He was there to party. I found out later that was typical of the middle officers of the ARVN. It's not like the American military where you rise on your own merits. It's like the Brits to this day. You know, if you're an officer, you have privilege. You're born in the right family and that sort of thing. It was that way in Vietnam. So the generals and the enlisted were squared away, but the middle officers weren't. And I knew if we won the war, it would have to be the middle officers. And I knew they were incompetent. So we were on our way back home, and it was a 13-hour flight from Okinawa to the States. We left at 7 in the evening, and we arrived 3 hours before we took off. I always remember that. It struck me, because on the way there, we crossed the international date line and missed September 1st, 1967. And now I was doubling up on whatever day in October that was, of 68. We were making our final approach into LAX. Airline pilot came on the intercom and said, we're diverting into El Toro Marine Air Base. And we turned to each other, what's going on? Why can't we find LAX? Some of us had family. I didn't. Some of us had family at LAX. The stewardess said, there's protesters at LAX. And we said, what are they protesting? Honest to God, it was an honest question. We didn't have any news. I didn't know what was happening for 13 months in the States, except that LBJ was not running for re-election. They said they were protesting you and the war. That's good. So anyway, we landed at El Toro, and that was the beginning of a new war I was about to face. We went from a shooting war to a war with our own fellow citizens, and it was basically not a war really, but a confrontation, because we were tasked to keep them in order. After my 30 days leave, I was assigned to Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. The very first thing I did was, as officers, we went to civil disturbance school. So we learned how to control the demonstrators, because you can't let 250,000 people out of control. And that's what happened in Washington, D.C. on November 15th, 1969. We were tasked to reinforce the Washington, D.C. police. There was a crowd of 250,000 demonstrators who were protesting the war. Okay. Now, I have a 10% rule and a 1% rule, and I think it's pretty accurate. 10% of any group of 100 or more those 10 people are going to be a little bit strange, different. Maybe you need 1,000, so 100 out of 1,000, whatever. And then one person out of that 100 will have there'll be a thief, some criminal intent. So if you take a crowd of 250,000, 1% of 250,000 is 2,500 people. So we knew that there were 2,500 people who were out to do harm, to hurt us, to hurt others, to create chaos, damage. Well, I'm sure 10% of the people were out to do damage, but 1% were out to get you as a military person. There was a battalion out of Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, and a battalion out of Fort Bragg, North Carolina, that were descending on Washington, D.C. to back up D.C. police. So about 450 out of 900 military we staged at Fort Andrews Air Force Base. I was the assistant operations officer of a regiment. So I reported directly to the colonel. And the colonel said, Lieutenant Reitman, I want you to go to Fort Holabird, Maryland, which is the intel gathering, to find out what the protesters are up to. So I went on a daily basis for about 4 days to gather just information about what are their plans. The 2,500, what is the inside scoop on these problem children? This never happens today. Military will, in the civilian community, oftentimes wear civilian clothes just to blend in. Back then we were kind of ignorant to all of this, and so I was riding in an open-air Jeep with a driver, and of course the Jeep goes like 50 miles an hour top speed, right? That's floored. And so everybody's passing us, and I was getting, now this has never meant peace to me. I don't have any disrespect for people that say, hey, buddy, I even have military guys that'll do this, and I go, hi. I've never met this as a sign of friendship. I've never put these two fingers up from 1968 to this day as a sign of friendship. Degradation to the worst. Every possible word used, and you can hear the stuff here in an open-air Jeep, all the words, the spitting, there was spit'em on the windshield. That was the reality of what it was like to deal with the anti-war demonstrators. And when I went to civil disturbance school, backing up a little bit, I had to learn how to lead Marines in doing things like the goose step, where you'd have to, you'd be on line, you have to control the crowd, so we would do this goose step, so you'd do this just very slowly, moving forward, with your weapon at the ready. Oh, and one of the things that happened that my colonel, I respect him and admire him to this day, when we got deployed there, we never got called out to quell the demonstrators. The D.C. police, thank God, were able to quell the demonstrators, because we were all combat-hardened veterans. And they tore down the flag at our sacred shrine, the Iwo Jima Memorial. They tore down the flag that night. And it's a good thing we weren't deployed, because we would have, and maybe I shouldn't say this, but we ripped people apart limb by limb with our bare hands. We wouldn't need any. We lost 5,000 Marines in capturing Iwo Jima in World War II. And they're tearing down that flag. That is not okay. Anyway, the colonel had the wonderful forethought of saying, okay, ammunition will be held by the company commanders, handcuffed to their wrist, and will only be unlocked and given to the troops on my command. So from the colonel to the captain to the troops. So eliminated like a couple of layers of bureaucracy there. Now, what's interesting about this story is 6 months later, Kent State happened, where those National Guard men killed some college students, all right? Those National Guardsmen should never have been locked and loaded. The ammunition should have been handcuffed to the captain standing 50 feet behind him. But my colonel foresaw that a Kent State was possible 6 months before it happened. I'm not disparaging the National Guard at all. They're civilian soldiers. They do an outstanding job. And there was no body of work. Those 18-year-old riflemen saw those college kids attack, running after them, and open fire. I mean, it only takes one lunatic to do this, but they should never have been locked and loaded. Before I went in the military, there was ambivalency on the college campus. Those of us who felt strongly one way or the other, which was probably only 20% of the student body, 10% were for the war and 10% were against it, and the others could care less. And we had actually two marches, one for and one against the Vietnam War at St. Mary's College in the spring of '66. And then when I went to war, well, politics of war wasn't, we had much more important things to be concerned about. It only struck us when we were on our final approach going into LAX that we understood that there was something called an anti-war movement. And how it affected us was, I was very fortunate because my orders were directly from Vietnam to Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. So from one military situation to another. And Camp Lejeune North Carolina and its surrounding civilian population were pro-military. I mean, they're very survival, dependent on having that military base there. So there was very little anti-war activism the year I was there. We had race riots, though. We had black on white military. There was no racial issues in Vietnam, but for some reason it exploded when we came back. Two-star general asked me to form a biracial committee to form weekly. We had 6 blacks and 6 whites that would meet on every week to discuss, okay, what are the issues here? Let's iron out our problems before they become major ones. And we had things about like the afro haircut. They couldn't understand why they couldn't wear an afro. Major general walked into when I was doing this meeting. I'm a first lieutenant. Here's a major general. It's like God just walked in the room. He says, "Now, may I come in?" And I said, "Yes, sir, you may." So he's sitting at the head of the table. I'm kind of in the flow. We're sitting around a conference table. And this afro thing kind of struck me. I said, "Why can't we have a little hair a little longer?" So I turned to the general. I said, "General, would you mind answering that question about?" He says, "Well, it's a very simple answer, really. Lice can be a problem when you're in the field all the time in unsanitary conditions. If you have bald heads, the lice can't jump to that part of your hair dynamic on your body." Everybody accepted that. So that was actually the precursor to something called human relations, where company commanders would meet with their 150 Marines on a weekly basis. This followed my committee some months later. The anti-war movement, there was a lot of emotions. I mean, I wouldn't take anybody out if I saw them on the street, but I'd be hard-pressed to control myself. The passions ran very strong and very deep on both sides. When we were doing our civil disturbance, we were very disciplined. We never really got to practice what we learned, but our attitude was we didn't understand where they were coming from. Why are you blaming us for this war? If our 4-star generals had any chutzpah, they would have went into the Oval Office and said, "Commander-in-Chief, this is terrible what you're doing. Here's my 4 stars. You can have my pension and everything. I'm going to talk to the press about really what's going on in Vietnam." And that didn't happen. It was ludicrous. And I think anti-war activists who are now in their 60s would admit that it was a mistake to go after that individual veteran, because they're showing it by their actions. But there is a lot of anti-military. It's all under the table now. It's not spoken. Like we don't get much turnout at our Veterans Day vigils and that sort of thing that we just had the other day. Very few come from, and I'm not going to get political, but one side doesn't show up and the other side does. I mentioned before, but I didn't fully flesh it out, that I was lucky to go from one military to another. The enlisted guys weren't so lucky, who were getting out right away, because they would go, a lot of them went use the GI Bill to go back to college campuses, and they learned to hide the fact that they were in Vietnam. They grew their hair long and said no. And even if they were for the effort to free people from the scourge of communism and are proud to have served their country, they wouldn't talk about it. That's what you learn, because you were ostracized, you were treated badly. If you were in uniform, you'd be spit at, cursed, mocked. Everything bad would happen to you. So you couldn't survive on a college campus if you, the typical, I'm not talking about the more traditional, I'm talking about the University of Madison, the Berkeleys, University of Minnesota, any big university was, you just didn't dare walk around in uniform. Your physical safety was definitely in jeopardy. Not only to be called bad names, but bad things done to you. I jumped from landing in El Toro to Camp Lejeune. There was a 30-day leave of absence, and I just happened to think about that my brother's family in Chicago, he got a bunch of the little kids, they were probably 10, 12-year-olds who had musical instruments. And he gathered them all together in his front lawn, and a Welcome Home Roger sign there. And all these little kids were playing their instruments, and we sang, God Bless America, and the national anthem and all that. I have a picture around somewhere, and if you could broaden that picture of my face, I was a river. Yeah, it was flowing. But so there were some glimmers, and the population itself, it was primarily young people, college-age people, were the anti-war activists. Most people became against the war. The World War II guys were, you've heard of the silent majority? They were quite silent. As a matter of fact, the Veterans of Foreign Wars did not allow Vietnam veterans to join them in the 70s. They don't want anybody to know that now, and I'm a Veterans of Foreign Wars member, and they've made up for it. Like that yellow sign that's kind of fallen down behind there was a gift given to just a token of appreciation. I mean, this is how so that was some of the things that the VFW has tried to make up for that craziness. And I have a little problem with the Greatest Generation. My fellow warriors were great too. I would put up our fighting force right along, not any better or not any worse than the World War II guys. I mean that sincerely, because I knew a lot of the World War II guys, and they were competent, but they weren't any more competent than we were, and dedicated to a mission, accomplishing the mission. I was proud to have served my country for 27 years in the 4 years active duty and 23 in the reserve, 27-year total. I believe that we need a strong defense to ensure a strong freedom, because I believe in absolute evil. I know a lot of people don't believe in absolute evil, but I think that there are hundreds of thousands of people that have been raised from, 2 feet tall, maybe 4 years old, to hate the infidel. And so it doesn't matter if you hold hands and sing Kumbaya and tell them that we are all bad and they are all good. They're still going to take you out. I was honored to have served my country. I still serve the community in Veterans Affairs because that service is ongoing.